24 when this happened, and I already had plenty of experience with hiking and solo camping. I'd been living in Colorado for a few years and usually used free weekends to camp in national forest areas, mostly off-season, when there was almost no one around. At that time, I was in a quieter period of my life, recently out of a long relationship, working remote and trying to spend more time alone. I chose a dispersed camping area I already knew well, inside a national forest accessible by a long, poorly maintained dirt road. There was no infrastructure at all, no bathrooms, no marked sites, just informal clearings where people usually pitched tents. I arrived close to dusk after hours of driving and hiking. I didn't see a single parked car or any recent sign of use. The place was completely silent, only the distant sound of wind in the treetops and a few insects. I set up my tent in a small clearing, made something simple to eat, and went to bed early, tired, with that good feeling of total isolation. The night was cold but steady. There wasn't much wind and the sky was clear enough for the moon to partially light the forest. I fell asleep quickly, heavily. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up without knowing exactly why. It wasn't a jolt or a loud noise. It was that strange feeling that something around you has changed. I lay still for a few seconds, listening. That's when I noticed a low, very specific sound coming from very close by. It was the unmistakable sound of fabric being stretched, the dry sound of nylon being pulled carefully. Then I heard something even clearer, the sound of a stake being driven into the ground. It wasn't hard. It was controlled, like someone trying to make as little noise as possible. My whole body tensed immediately. It made no sense. I had arrived alone, off-season, in a place where there was no one for miles. And yet someone was setting up a tent just a few meters from mine in the middle of the night, in complete silence. I stayed motionless inside my tent, trying to control my breathing so I wouldn't make noise. The sound continued, always low, always close. I could recognize the sequence of movements, stretching the fabric, adjusting something, then the dry thud of another stake going into the soil. There was no talking, no flashlight, none of the normal fumbling you hear when someone pitches a tent in the dark. Everything felt slow and deliberate. I reached for my flashlight carefully, trying not to make the zipper sound. I waited a few more seconds, building up courage, and then turned on the light for an instant, aiming toward the sound through the fabric of my tent. I saw a silhouette a few meters away, crouched, clearly human, working with something on the ground. Someone was setting up a tent. The body moved with precision, like someone who had done it for a long time. When the light appeared, the silhouette didn't react. It didn't turn, didn't stop, didn't speed up. It continued at the exact same pace. I turned the flashlight off almost immediately, my heart pounding too hard in my chest. My first reaction was to try to rationalize it. I thought maybe someone had arrived late like me and decided to camp there without realizing someone was already nearby. But that didn't explain the hour or the absolute silence. Most people would make some noise, use a light, maybe even say something when they noticed another tent close by. Not here. The sounds continued for a few more minutes and then stopped completely. I didn't hear footsteps walking away, no tent zipper closing, no sleeping bag being arranged. Just silence again. I stayed awake for far too long, not knowing if that person was now inside the supposed tent or standing outside. At some point, exhaustion won, but it was light, broken sleep where every snap in the forest sounded too loud. I woke up before dawn, with that bluish light starting to filter into the tent. The first thing I did was stay still, trying to hear any sign of movement around me. I heard nothing but the normal sounds of the forest slowly waking up. No zipper, no footsteps, no nearby breathing. I waited a few more minutes before moving, my body rigid with tension. I grabbed the flashlight again and this time opened the tent zipper just enough to look outside. The clearing was empty. There was no tent set up next to mine. Where I had seen the silhouette hours earlier, there was only bare dirt and leaves. I stepped out slowly, carefully looking around in silence. The air was cold and damp, carrying that wet earth smell typical of forest mornings. That's when I looked at the ground and my stomach dropped. There were fresh marks in the soil, far too clear to be old. The shape of stakes that had been driven in and removed was still visible. Small holes aligned as if a tent really had been set up there and then taken down. Closer to my tent, I saw footprints. They weren't just footprints going back and forth. They formed a circle around my tent, overlapping tracks as if someone had walked around it multiple times. Some were so close to the fabric they looked like they'd been made just inches from the wall. I stood there staring for a long time, trying to understand why someone would set up a tent in silence in the middle of the night, take everything down before dawn, and still spend the entire night walking around where I slept. I walked a full loop around the clearing, trying to keep my head clear. There was no obvious trail leading out, just confused marks mixed with leaves and soft dirt. The footprints didn't go toward any specific path. Some began and ended near my tent as if the person had stayed there for long periods without leaving. I didn't find backpack marks, trash, or any sign of a fire. Nothing that suggested someone had actually been camping there for more than a few minutes. That unsettled me more than if I'd found an abandoned tent. The scene felt incomplete, like only part of the activity had happened. I packed my things faster than normal, folding my sleeping bag carelessly and stuffing everything away in silence, always scanning the trees between movements. While I was taking down my own tent, I started thinking about the night before with more clarity. The person hadn't reacted to the flashlight. They hadn't stopped, hurried, or shown surprise. That didn't fit someone trying to avoid being seen by accident. It fit someone who already knew I was there and didn't care about being noticed. The more I thought about it, the more wrong it all felt. That person chose to set up a tent right next to mine, in a space that was clearly already occupied. They chose to do it in the middle of the night, in absolute silence, and then sometime before dawn they took everything down and spent the whole night walking around where I slept. The idea that I'd been asleep while someone moved that close to my body put a knot in my stomach I couldn't ignore. I decided to leave immediately. I didn't make coffee, I didn't eat anything. I just threw everything into the car and started driving back down the dirt road, with the constant feeling that someone could be standing between the trees watching me leave. I drove slowly but with urgency at the same time, looking to the sides more than at the road in some stretches. I didn't see anyone. No parked car, no torn down tent dumped anywhere. When I finally reached the main road, I felt my body loosen a little, but my mind was still racing. I stopped at a gas station a few dozen miles later just to breathe, wash my face, and organize my thoughts. While drinking coffee that was far too bad for that hour, I tried listing possible explanations. An eccentric camper, someone messing with me, a perception error caused by sleep. None of those theories explained the marks in the ground or the fact that someone had spent the entire night circling my tent without making noise. In the days that followed, that night wouldn't leave my head. I looked up old photos of the area, maps, other campers' reports. I didn't find anything specific, but I realized something I'd never considered before. That clearing wasn't a common camping spot. I'd chosen it because it felt discreet and out of the way, but that also meant it wasn't a place someone would stumble into by accident. Someone had to look for that spot, had to know where to set up, had to arrive already knowing another tent was there. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that the person wasn't trying to hide. They were positioning themselves. A few weeks later, I told the story to someone I knew who worked as a forest ranger without naming the exact location. He listened quietly and only said that off-season, the official recommendation was not to camp alone in dispersed areas, precisely because there's no control over who comes in or out. He also mentioned they'd received odd reports from campers finding marks around tents, but that there was almost never anyone to hold responsible when they investigated. He didn't go into details, and I didn't push. That was enough to confirm I wasn't the only person who'd experienced something like it. Today I still hike and camp, but never alone in completely isolated areas off-season, and I never arrive at dusk anymore. What bothers me most when I think back to that night isn't imagining who the person was or what they wanted. It's knowing that while I slept believing I was completely alone, someone spent hours there, close enough to touch my tent, choosing to stay silent. There was no confrontation, no direct threat, just presence. And that was enough for me to understand that in that Colorado forest I wasn't as alone as I thought. Story 2. I was 29 when this happened, and I was going through a difficult phase. I'd been working from home for months, had just come out of a long relationship, and felt like my mind never shut off. I decided to take a few days and go alone to a state park in Virginia where I had camped before with friends. The idea was simple: silence, light hiking, one isolated night to sleep properly and organize my thoughts. I arrived at the park in the early afternoon, got the permit, spoke briefly with the attendant at the entrance, and headed to a more remote camping area that allowed single tents. It wasn't peak season, so there were few people in the park, and none in that specific section. I set up my tent while there was still daylight, organized my things, made a simple meal, and sat for a while observing the woods. Everything seemed normal. The place was quiet, just the sound of insects and wind moving through the leaves. I felt safe there, maybe even too confident because I had camped before. When it got fully dark, the temperature dropped a little, but nothing unexpected. I went into the tent early, read a few pages on my phone until the battery started to run low, and turned off the flashlight. The night was dark without a strong moon, and the forest seemed to absorb any distant sound. I was almost asleep when I heard a whistle. It was low, short, coming from somewhere in the woods, not very close, but not far either. At first I thought it might be an animal or even someone at another campsite, though I knew there was no one nearby. I ignored it. A few minutes later I heard it again. The same kind of whistle, the same tone. My body tensed slightly, but I still tried to rationalize it. I took a deep breath and stayed still, waiting to hear something else. The sound didn't repeat right away, and I thought it had just been a coincidence. I lay there trying to fall asleep again, but sleep didn't come easily after that. A few minutes later, I suddenly felt the urge to cough, the kind you can't hold back. I turned my face toward the sleeping bag and coughed once quietly, trying to muffle the sound. Almost immediately after that, the whistling stopped. There was no echo, no continuation. It was as if someone had switched off a sound. That made me open my eyes in the dark, my heart picking up a little. I stayed still, listening. A few seconds passed in total silence, just the normal forest sounds. No whistling. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but the way the sound stopped right after my cough stuck in my head. Sometime later, I moved my leg inside the sleeping bag to try to get more comfortable. The tent fabric made a faint noise, almost imperceptible. As soon as I stopped moving, I heard the whistle again, same duration, same tone, apparently from the same direction. My stomach went cold instantly. I froze, holding my breath, trying to understand whether it was really reacting to me. I waited a few seconds and slowly moved my hand. The sound stopped again. It didn't return until I breathed more deeply, and then a few seconds later the whistle came back. That stopped feeling like coincidence far too quickly. It was as if someone was listening closely to every small noise I made and using the whistle as a response. From that point on, my body went into a strange state of alert. I didn't want to move, but I couldn't relax either. I lay there, counting the time between one sound and the next. The whistle wasn't constant. It appeared, stopped, and only came back when I made some involuntary noise, no matter how small. At no point did it seem to get closer, but it also didn't move away. It was always coming from the same spot in the woods, as if someone had chosen a specific position. I tried to grab my phone to check the time, but just stretching my arm made the tent fabric creak slightly, and the whistle answered again. That's when I felt a chill run up my back that had nothing to do with the temperature. It wasn't fear of an immediate attack. It was the feeling of being watched patiently. I stayed like that for a long time, longer than it probably really was. At some point, I realized I was trying not to breathe deeply, afraid of triggering the sound. That alone was absurd, but I couldn't stop. I thought about turning on the flashlight, but the idea of revealing exactly where I was, even if that was already obvious, made me give up. I thought about screaming, but that didn't seem like a good idea either. All I wanted was for the night to pass quickly. At one point, my muscles started to ache from so much tension. When I had to change position again, the whistle responded immediately, as if it had been waiting for it. There was no doubt at that moment. Someone was awake out there, and they were testing whether I was too. At some point in the middle of the night, I began to lose track of time. The sky still seemed completely dark, but I no longer knew whether minutes or hours had passed since it started. The whistle kept following the same pattern. Whenever I stayed completely still for a longer period, it stopped. All it took was swallowing, adjusting the sleeping bag, or even breathing a bit deeper, and the sound returned, short and controlled. There was no urgency in it. That bothered me more than if it had been constant. It felt like someone repeatedly confirming that I was still there, awake, reacting. I started wondering if that was the goal, to keep me awake. The more I thought about it, the harder it was to relax and the easier it became to trigger the sound without meaning to. I tried to change strategy and stay completely still even though I was uncomfortable. I held my breath for a few seconds, then breathed very slowly, trying not to move the tent fabric. The whistle didn't come back for longer than usual. That gave me a brief hope, as if maybe the person had gone away. But all it took was my stomach growling softly, an involuntary sound, for the whistle to reappear almost immediately. I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling a knot form in my throat. This wasn't just someone passing nearby. It was someone far too attentive to my physical limits, to the small sounds I couldn't control. That turned the tent, which had felt like shelter before, into something far too fragile. At some point, exhaustion started to fight with fear. I felt my eyes getting heavy, but I couldn't allow myself to really sleep. Every time my body began to relax, some involuntary movement happened, and the whistle came back right on cue. It created a cycle that was hard to break. I kept imagining someone standing out there somewhere among the trees, just listening, not running, not approaching, just waiting for signs from me. The fact that the sound always came from the same spot made me believe the person wasn't moving around but positioned, as if they had chosen a place with a direct view of the tent and decided to stay there all night. That idea made me feel exposed in a way I had never felt before while camping. Around what I estimated was close to dawn, the whistle started taking longer to respond. I didn't know if it was because I was managing to stay more still or if something had changed out there. The silence stretched longer between one sound and the next, but still any small noise I made brought the whistle back. When the first faint light began to brighten the inside of the tent, I felt an immediate, almost physical relief. Not because I thought the person would leave with daylight, but because I would finally be able to see. I waited a bit longer, gathering courage, before moving for real. The whistle didn't return when the sky began to lighten, and somehow that made me even more nervous. I waited as long as I could before opening the tent zipper. The inside was bright enough to see my things, and the forest sounds had shifted to morning ones, birds and steadier wind. Even so, I sat there for a few minutes listening, trying to identify any footsteps or unusual movement. I heard nothing. When I finally opened the tent and stepped out, the first thing I did was slowly turn, looking all around. There was no one in sight. No nearby tent, no obvious sign of anyone close. The woods looked far too normal, which gave me a strange sense of contrast with the night before. The air was cold and clean, and everything seemed too calm for someone to have spent hours out there. That's when I looked at the ground and felt my stomach drop. There were human footprints around my campsite. They weren't scattered randomly. They formed a semicircle around the tent, all positioned in places where someone would have a direct view of it. Some were farther back, near the trees, and others closer, almost touching the space where I had gone in and out. They weren't old prints. The ground was still slightly damp, and the footprints were well defined. I stood there staring at them, trying to understand how long that person had been moving around my space. There were no signs of a direct approach to the tent, just observation. I knelt down to look at the footprints more closely, trying to keep my head clear. They weren't from running or from someone just passing through. They were marks of someone who stopped, shifted weight, stepped again in the same spot. Some were deeper, as if the person had stood there for a while. I followed the trail with my eyes and realized it didn't move away in a straight line. The footprints shifted position around the tent, always keeping an angle that allowed a view of the inside through the mesh or the outline of the fabric. At no point did I see marks approaching directly to touch the tent. That sent a strange chill through me. It didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like surveillance, as if the person had been checking throughout the night whether I was awake or not, without ever getting too close. I didn't stay there long. I started breaking camp immediately with fast, disorganized movements. I packed everything without making coffee, without sitting down, doing nothing beyond what was necessary to leave. While I packed, I constantly looked toward the woods, expecting to see someone standing between the trees. I didn't see anyone, Still, the feeling that I had been watched until just minutes earlier wouldn't go away. When I put on my backpack and started walking back along the short trail to the parking area, I kept feeling like a whistle could start again behind me at any moment. It didn't. But the silence of that morning felt too heavy to be normal. The walk back to the parking area was short, but it felt far too long. Every branch snapping under my feet made me pause for a second, waiting to hear some response from the woods. I heard nothing beyond the normal sounds of the day beginning. When I reached my car, I felt an immediate, almost embarrassing relief, like I had been exaggerating everything. Even so, before getting in, I walked all the way around the vehicle, checking the ground and the surroundings. There were no footprints there, no sign anyone had passed nearby. I got into the car, locked the doors, and sat there for a few minutes, just breathing, trying to slow down. The forest in daylight looked completely different from the night before, and that almost made me doubt myself. I drove to the park exit without turning on the radio, alone with my thoughts. At the gate, the morning attendant asked if everything had been okay. I hesitated for a second before saying yes. I didn't even know where to begin explaining what had happened or whether I would be taken seriously. On the drive back home, the image of the footprints kept returning to my mind, especially how deliberately they were positioned. They weren't marks of someone lost or curious. They were marks of someone who chose where to stand and stayed there for hours, reacting to every sound I made. That idea stayed with me the rest of the day, even when I tried to distract myself with normal things. After that day, I spent a long time trying to understand why it affected me so deeply. There was no confrontation, no direct threat, no attempt to enter the tent or speak to me. And yet the feeling of invasion was deeper than anything I had ever experienced outdoors. The whistle wasn't used to scare me. It was used to measure me. Each sound I made generated a response, as if someone was repeatedly confirming that I was still conscious, still reacting. That turned the entire night into a kind of active waiting, where I never truly had a chance to rest. I later realized that what was most disturbing wasn't the presence of someone, but the subtle control that person exerted over my behavior without ever approaching. It took me months before I camped alone again. When I did, I chose busier areas and paid excessive attention to the sounds around me. Even today, when I'm in complete silence and hear a distant whistle, my body reacts before my mind does. That night in the Virginia park taught me something I hadn't considered before. Not every danger shows itself as approach or attack. Sometimes it stays still at a distance, simply watching and waiting for responses. Knowing that someone spent an entire night out there, attentive to every cough and every movement I made, was enough to change how I understand isolation. Because at that campsite, I was alone, but I was never without company. Over time, I stopped trying to figure out who the person was or why they were there. There was no answer that truly resolved what I felt. It didn't help to imagine an extreme scenario or to minimize it as something trivial. What happened was simple and at the same time heavy. Someone spent an entire night adjusting their behavior to mine, reacting to every sound I made without ever revealing themselves. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't chance. It was someone testing presence, attention, and limits. The footprints around the tent made that painfully clear. It wasn't a passing route. It was a position, and thinking about that later, calmly, was almost worse than the fear I felt at the time. Today, when I think back on that night, I don't think first about the whistle. I think about the silence between them, the intervals when I thought it was over, only to realize that all it took was a small movement for everything to start again. That experience taught me that isolation isn't just the absence of visible people. Sometimes it's exactly the opposite. When someone chooses to stay outside your field of view, attentive enough to respond, but distant enough to never be confronted. I left that park physically unharmed, but with a certainty that never went away. In that Virginia forest, someone spent the entire night listening to me breathe, waiting for signs that I was awake. And that was real enough for me to never forget. Story 3. I was 36 when this happened, and I was on a solo backpacking trip through northern Minnesota. I've always liked camping near more remote lakes, far from heavily used areas, and I already had enough experience to feel comfortable on my own. At that point in my life, I was between jobs and using the free time to stay out of the city as much as possible. I chose a small lake inside a public area, accessible only after several hours of hiking along a lightly marked trail. I arrived in the late afternoon, tired but satisfied that I hadn't seen a single person all day. The place was completely silent, just the sound of water gently hitting the shore and a few distant birds. I set up my tent a few meters from the lake's edge on a flat spot and used a large fallen log as a bench to cook and eat. I sat there for a long time, looking at the dark water and the reflection of the trees, before packing everything away and going to sleep. The night was cold, but there wasn't much wind. I got into the tent early, more out of exhaustion than sleepiness, and ended up falling asleep quickly. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound I didn't immediately recognize. It was a low, uneven creaking like wood being slowly pressed. At first, I thought it might be a tree shifting under the weight of the wind, but the sound was too close and always came from the same spot. I lay there motionless, trying to identify it better. When I heard it again, I realized it was coming exactly from the direction of the lake where the log was. The sound wasn't continuous. It was as if something heavy was adjusting its weight on the wood. My heart started to race, and I carefully grabbed my flashlight without turning it on yet, trying to hear more before moving. I stayed still for a few seconds, gathering the courage to do anything. I took a deep breath and very slowly pulled the tent zipper just enough to create a small opening. I didn't turn on the flashlight. The moonlight already illuminated part of the lakeshore. That's when I saw the silhouette. A man was sitting exactly on the log where I had been hours earlier. He had his back to the lake and was facing my tent, his body leaning slightly forward like someone sitting to wait. I couldn't see facial details, just the shape of his head and shoulders. He wasn't moving. He didn't seem to be looking around. He was looking straight at the tent. The creaking sound I had heard was the weight of him settling on the wood. My whole body froze. It wasn't a vague shape or something that could be mistaken for a tree or a shadow. It was clearly a person. There was no flashlight, no backpack, no audible breathing, just that presence sitting still in the same place I had occupied not long before. I stayed there, holding the zipper between my fingers, trying not to make any sound. The silence was so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I didn't think about speaking or shouting. All I could think was that this person had chosen that log on purpose. It wasn't the most comfortable spot in the clearing, nor the most hidden. It was exactly the point that offered a direct view of my tent. I stayed there for a stretch of time that felt longer than it probably was. I can't say whether it was seconds or minutes. At some point, my arm started to ache from holding the zipper in that position, and I made the smallest movement to adjust my hand. That was enough. The instant the tent fabric made a faint sound, the man reacted. He stood up from the log slowly with no hurry at all. He didn't turn his head toward me or make any sudden gesture. He just stood there for a second, as if confirming something, and then took 2 steps backward, entering the forest. The strangest part was the silence. No branches breaking, no heavy footsteps, no sound of leaves being crushed. He simply disappeared among the trees as if he knew exactly where to step. I stayed motionless after that, waiting to hear anything that might indicate he was still nearby. I heard nothing. No footsteps moving away. No water shifting at the edge of the lake. Gradually, the normal sounds of the night returned as if nothing had happened. I couldn't fall asleep again. I sat inside the tent until the sky began to lighten, flashlight in hand, staring at the opening. Every forest sound made my body react, expecting that silhouette to appear again. The log was still there, visible even in the dark, now empty. The idea that someone had been sitting there, silently watching me, was impossible to ignore. When morning fully arrived, I carefully stepped out of the tent, my body exhausted and tense as if I hadn't rested at all. The first thing I did was look straight at the log. It wasn't in the same position as the night before. It had been rotated, pulled a few inches closer to my tent in a way that clearly hadn't happened on its own. It hadn't been dragged far, but enough to change the angle, as if someone had tried to position it. I stood there for a few seconds trying to understand why. That's when I realized that from this new position, the log was now exactly aligned with the tent entrance. partially blocking the exit if I had tried to leave quickly during the night. I crouched down to look at the ground around it and saw fresh marks. There weren't many, but they were clear enough. Human footprints going back and forth between the forest and the log, along with deeper marks near where it had been moved. There were no signs of running or struggle. Everything suggested slow, controlled movements. A cold feeling settled in my stomach that's hard to describe. The person hadn't just sat there watching me. He had moved things around while I was sleeping, testing positions, adjusting the space. I started breaking camp immediately, my hands shaking a little more than I'd like to admit. As I packed my gear, I kept thinking about the exact moment he stood up and left. There was no surprise, no urgency. It was as if he had gotten what he wanted the moment he realized I was awake. That bothered me more than if he had tried to talk to me or approach me. It felt like I had interrupted something, not prevented it. I packed everything without making coffee, without sitting down, without looking at the lake for more than a few seconds. Every time I turned to grab something, I automatically looked toward the trees, expecting to see someone standing there. I didn't see anyone. The hike back along the trail felt longer than on the way in. Every snap underfoot made me stop for a second, trying to hear whether there were footsteps matching mine. I heard nothing beyond the usual sounds. Still, the sense that someone knew that place better than I did wouldn't leave my mind. When I finally reached my car, I felt immediate relief, almost physical. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a few minutes before starting the engine, looking in the rearview mirror even though it made no sense there. In the days that followed, that image returned again and again. The man sitting on the log where I had been hours earlier, motionless, staring at the tent. What stayed with me most wasn't just his presence, but his use of the space. He didn't choose a random spot. He chose exactly the place that had already been part of my routine that night, as if he wanted to occupy something of mine, even symbolically. I never found out who he was or why he was there, and maybe that's the worst part. Because at that remote lake in Minnesota, it became clear to me that someone spent enough time watching me to decide where to sit, when to stand, and how to leave without being heard, and that was far too real to ignore. Story 4. I was 41 years old when this happened, and I usually camp alone whenever I can. I live in Boise, Idaho, and I spend most of my workdays sitting down, so getting out into the forest is the way I've found to keep my head straight. That particular week I was exhausted, sleeping poorly, and constantly feeling overstimulated. I chose an area of national forest I had been to before, very remote, with no cell signal. Because of that, I brought a small emergency portable radio, the simple battery-powered kind just in case I needed to hear weather updates or draw attention in an extreme situation. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked far from the main trail, and hiked to a discreet spot near a cluster of denser trees. There were no other cars and no recent signs of use. I set up my tent, made a quick meal, and left the radio turned off inside the tent next to my backpack. When it got dark, the forest became completely silent, the kind of silence that feels heavier when you're alone. There wasn't much wind, and the night was warmer than I expected. I went into the tent early, read a bit by flashlight, and turned everything off to try to sleep. The radio stayed beside me, turned off, with no reason to be used. I remember this clearly because I even checked the knob before lying down. I fell asleep quickly but lightly. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to a dry, unexpected sound very close to my head. It took me a few seconds to understand what it was. It was the radio. It had turned on by itself. The indicator light was on, and the device was emitting nothing but static, far too loud for the absolute silence around me. I lay there for a few seconds trying to understand how that was possible. The radio didn't have an alarm, no automatic programming, nothing like that. It was a simple model with a rotating on-off knob. Even so, there it was, turned on, spewing constant static. I slowly reached out and lowered the volume, careful not to make too much noise. As soon as the static dropped, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Between the noise, I could hear an irregular sound, like someone breathing with difficulty, pulling air in heavily. It wasn't a clean pattern, but it didn't sound like normal interference either. It was too rhythmic. I held my breath for a few seconds to make sure it wasn't me. The sound continued. I stayed completely still, listening to that in the dark, trying to convince myself it was just some badly tuned, distant transmission. After a few seconds like that, another sound began to mix in with the breathing. A dry, repeated crack like dry leaves being crushed under slow footsteps. The sound didn't clearly come from the radio or clearly from outside. It seemed to be in both places at the same time, which made me deeply uncomfortable. I adjusted the tuning knob, turning it slowly. The static changed, but the sounds kept appearing through it, as if they weren't tied to a specific frequency. My heart started pounding hard and I felt heat rise in my chest. I didn't hear any clear footsteps outside the tent, but the idea that someone might be there, so close, while the radio reproduced something like that, left me frozen. I turned the radio off completely, twisting the knob all the way down. Silence returned all at once. The silence that followed was too heavy. It wasn't relief. It felt like something had been cut off midstream. I lay there with my hand still near the radio, waiting to hear any sound from outside the tent. I didn't hear footsteps, branches breaking or breathing, just the normal, distant forest noises. Even so, my body stayed on high alert. I couldn't close my eyes again. Every second, I expected the radio to turn on again. At some point, I gathered the courage to pick it up and check it more closely. I touched it carefully and felt something that didn't make sense. It was cold, like it had been off for hours, not like a device that had just been on. Still, I had seen the light on. I had heard the sounds. I placed the radio a bit farther from my head and sat inside the tent, hugging my knees, trying to organize my thoughts. My mind jumped between possible explanations, but none of them held up for long. Interference didn't explain the breathing. A sleep illusion didn't explain the sound of leaves being stepped on in the same rhythm for so long. At one point, I heard something outside the tent. It wasn't a clear step, just a light dragging sound, like someone shifting position too close. I held my breath and didn't move. The sound didn't repeat, but the sense of proximity remained. I knew that if someone was out there, they were being quiet on purpose, and that scared me more than noise would have. I stayed like that for far too long to measure. The sky was still completely dark, and the only way I knew the night continued was that nothing changed around me. At some point, the radio turned on again. There was no loud click or visible movement. The static simply returned, low at first, as if someone had carefully turned the knob. The breathing sound reappeared almost immediately, more irregular than before, as if it were closer to the microphone. My stomach lurched instantly. I didn't move. I didn't touch the device, I just listened. The sound of footsteps on dry leaves came back too, now more spaced out, like someone walking slowly, stopping, then walking again. It was impossible to tell whether that was coming from the radio or actually happening around the tent and being picked up somehow. The confusion between the sounds left me completely locked in place. The worst part was realizing that the noises seemed to react to what I did. When I breathed more deeply, the breathing on the radio changed. When I shifted slightly, the sound of leaves became more present for a few seconds. It wasn't immediate, but it was consistent enough for me to notice the pattern. That made me stop moving entirely. I lay there, rigid, feeling my muscles start to ache. I didn't want to provoke anything. At one point, I felt the urge to run out of there, but the idea of opening the tent in the dark, not knowing who or what was nearby, felt even worse. I kept waiting for dawn. Listening to the radio I had brought specifically for safety turned into the most disturbing thing of the night. At some point in the early morning, exhaustion began to weigh as much as fear. I was exhausted, my muscles locked from staying still, but I couldn't relax. The radio stayed on, alternating static and those irregular sounds like someone very close, breathing out of rhythm. At one point, the breathing became slower, deeper, and the footsteps on leaves stopped for a few minutes. The silence between one sound and the next was almost worse because it made me anticipate the next noise. I tried, with extreme care, to reach for the radio and turn it off again. When my fingers touched the device, the static suddenly grew louder, as if someone had turned up the volume from the other side. Pulling my hand back was automatic. I didn't try to touch it again. Time dragged on until finally the darkness began to lighten slightly. It wasn't daylight yet, but it was clear the night was losing its grip. In that interval, the radio turned itself off, without a click, without transition. A flat silence took over everything. I waited a few minutes before moving, listening closely for any sign from outside. I heard nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no dragging sounds. Still, I didn't feel safe. I stayed sitting inside the tent until the light allowed me to see better, my heart still racing, repeating to myself that as soon as I could, I would get out of there. When I finally gathered the courage to leave the tent, it was early enough to see the surrounding forest clearly. The air was cold and damp, and everything looked far too normal after what had happened during the night. I stepped out slowly, looking around before taking any real step. There was no one visible, no movement among the trees, no unusual sounds. The first thing I did was look at the radio. I picked it up and tried to turn it on again. Nothing happened. I checked the battery compartment, thinking maybe it had failed during the night. That's when a sharp knot formed in my stomach. The battery wasn't connected. It hadn't come loose. It was completely out of its slot, placed beside it as if someone had carefully opened the compartment, removed it, and closed it again. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at that, trying to understand how the radio had worked without any power at all. I began breaking camp immediately. As I packed my things, I noticed something on the outside of the tent, exactly at the height where my head was when I slept. There were muddy fingerprints pressed against the fabric. They weren't random smudges from wind or rain splatter. They were clear marks of someone placing their hand there, fingers spread, pressing into the material. Some marks were more defined, as if the person had leaned some weight. Others had slightly streaked, leaving thin trails of dirt. I stood there staring at it longer than I should have, feeling a chill run up my spine. That person hadn't just been there during the night. They had been close enough to touch the tent exactly where I was sleeping. I stood still for a few seconds, trying not to panic. I looked around again, slowly turning, expecting to see someone among the trees, but there was no one. The forest looked completely ordinary in the morning light, which made everything even harder to process. I rubbed my face, trying to organize my thoughts, and realized I was shaking slightly, not just from the cold. The marks on the tent were exactly at the height of my head and chest, as if someone had leaned in there very close, maybe listening. The idea that this had happened while I was awake but motionless made me deeply uncomfortable. It wasn't something that had gone unnoticed. I had been there, conscious, while someone was outside. I finished packing in a hurry, without eating, without sitting, doing nothing beyond what was necessary to leave. Every time I bent down to pack something, I felt that strange impression of being exposed, even knowing it was daylight. I put on my backpack and started walking back along the short trail to the car, looking over my shoulder several times. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear footsteps following me, but that didn't bring real relief. The silence of that morning felt too charged, as if the forest were simply returning to normal after something that shouldn't have happened there. When I reached the car, I felt immediate, almost automatic relief, but it didn't last long. I sat there for a few minutes before starting the engine, looking in the rearview mirror and at the tree line, as if expecting to see someone appear at any moment. Nothing happened. Even so, I couldn't relax. I drove out of the area without stopping, without taking in the scenery, focused only on reaching the main road. As cell service returned, I thought about calling someone and telling them what had happened, but I gave up. I didn't even know where to start without sounding exaggerated. Who would believe that a radio turned on without a battery in the middle of the night, playing sounds that seemed to come from outside the tent? In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize everything. Interference, stress, imagination fueled by isolation. But none of those explanations held up when I remembered the battery out of its slot and the muddy fingerprints exactly where my head had been. That had nothing to do with the radio itself. The radio was just the medium. What really stayed with me was knowing that someone had been out there, close enough to touch the tent, hear my breathing, and somehow use that object to keep me awake. There was no confrontation, no direct threat, but there was clear intent. To this day, I still camp, but I never bring one of those radios with me again. And I never sleep soundly when something meant to guarantee safety behaves as if it's being used by someone else. Story 5. I was 26 years old when this happened. and at that time I spent almost every weekend alone photographing landscapes. I lived in the state of Washington and especially liked little-used trails, where I could set up a tripod, wait for the right light, and not deal with other people passing by all the time. I worked a regular job during the week and used these outings as a way to clear my head. That particular weekend, I chose a secondary trail within a public area that I had seen mentioned in photography forums. It wasn't prohibited or secret, just lightly traveled. I arrived in the middle of the afternoon, hiked for a few hours, and decided to set up camp near a narrow stream with clean water and a gentle current. I didn't see anyone on the trail. No cars parked near the entrance, no recent signs of use. The place seemed completely empty. I set up the tent while there was still daylight, positioned the tripod a few meters away to take long exposure photos of the stream and surrounding vegetation, and then put the camera away for the night. I ate a simple dinner and sat for a while, listening to the water run and watching the darkness take over the trail. The night was cold but calm, with no strong wind. I went into the tent early, more to conserve energy than because I was sleepy, and lay there for a while listening to the normal sounds of the forest. At some point I realized I needed to get more water from the stream. I grabbed the bottle and the flashlight and went out, leaving the tent closed behind me. The stream was only a few meters away, visible even in the dark because of the faint moonlight reflecting on the water. I walked to the edge of the stream slowly, shining the flashlight on the ground so I wouldn't slip on the damp rocks. The water was running low, making a constant sound that helped mask other noises from the forest. I crouched down and submerged the bottle, paying attention not to stir up too much sediment. While waiting for it to fill, I kept looking at the surface of the water almost out of habit, watching the distorted reflections of the trees and the faint light behind me. That's when I saw something that didn't fit the rest of the scene. In the reflection behind my own silhouette, there was another shape. Too tall to be a bush, too defined to be just a shadow. It clearly looked like a person standing a few meters behind me, their body facing in my direction. The reflection didn't move, it didn't sway like the trees, it was far too steady. My body went cold instantly. I didn't make any sudden movement. I spent a few seconds just staring at that reflection, trying to understand if it was some trick of the light or exhaustion. The shape stayed there, motionless. I took a deep breath and turned around quickly, pointing the flashlight behind me. There was no one there. The trail was empty, exactly as it had been before. No sound of footsteps, no branches breaking, no shadow moving between the trees. The flashlight illuminated only trunks, leaves, and the uneven ground. I turned back to the stream and looked at the water again. The silhouette was gone. The reflection showed only my own distorted image and the surrounding vegetation. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to decide whether what I had seen was imagination or something too real to ignore. I stayed there for a few seconds, trying not to panic. The sound of the stream seemed far too loud now, as if it were filling a silence that hadn't existed before. I looked around once more, turning slowly, illuminating everything with the flashlight. Nothing. No movement, no unusual sound. Even so, that sense of presence didn't go away. I closed the bottle, stood up, and started back toward the camp, walking faster than on the way there. Each step sounded unnaturally loud on the leaf-covered ground. I turned around twice on the way, sure I would hear someone behind me. I didn't. When the tent finally appeared between the trees, I felt a brief, almost automatic sense of relief, as if that space were still safe. As soon as I got closer, I noticed something was wrong. The tripod wasn't where I had left it. It had been set up near the stream, a bit away from the tent, for night photos. Now it wasn't there. My stomach dropped immediately. I swept the area with the flashlight until I found the tripod a few meters away, behind a thicker tree partially hidden. It wasn't knocked over or abandoned. It was set up, firmly planted in the ground, with the camera pointed directly at my tent. The framing was far too precise to be accidental. It was aimed exactly at the front of the tent, at the height where my head would be when I lay down. Attached to one of the tripod's legs, folded simply, was a light-colored piece of paper. I approached carefully, feeling my hands sweat, and read what was written in plain letters. "Go away." I stood there staring at it for a few seconds that felt far too long. The paper didn't look old or wet, as if it had been placed there recently. The handwriting was simple, unhurried, with no scribbling, written far too clearly for someone acting on impulse. I immediately looked around, expecting to see someone moving away between the trees. That's when I heard footsteps. They weren't coming toward me. They were moving away slowly, crushing dry leaves underfoot, heading deeper into the denser forest. The sound wasn't of running. It was someone walking calmly, as if there were no urgency at all. I stayed perfectly still, holding the flashlight pointed at the ground, trying not to draw attention. The footsteps continued for a few seconds and then disappeared completely, swallowed by the more distant sound of the stream. My entire body was on maximum alert, but at the same time, part of me knew exactly what I needed to do. I didn't think about confronting anyone. I didn't think about yelling. I didn't think about calling anyone. The message was too direct to ignore. I went back to the tent and started breaking everything down immediately, with fast, unorganized movements. I didn't care about folding the sleeping bag properly or packing the camera carefully. Every noise I made, I paused for a second, expecting to hear footsteps returning. I didn't hear anything. The forest seemed to have gone deliberately quiet, as if it were watching my reaction. I threw everything into the backpack without worrying about organization. The tent was the last thing, rolled up hastily, still dirty with soil. While I did this, I felt that strange pressure on my back, as if someone were watching me from somewhere beyond the reach of the flashlight. I didn't hear any more footsteps, but the silence felt too intentional. I grabbed the tripod last without even looking at the camera, and tore the note off, folding it and shoving it into my pocket without thinking. In less than 10 minutes, the camp I had calmly set up hours earlier no longer existed. I put the backpack on and started walking down the trail in the dark, using the flashlight only as much as necessary to avoid tripping. Every sound behind me felt louder than it really was, but I never stopped once to look back. I walked for quite a while before realizing I was breathing too fast. I forced my pace to become steady, trying not to panic. At times I thought I heard something moving parallel to the trail, but I could never confirm it. There were no branches breaking, no clear footsteps, just that feeling of not being alone anymore. When I finally reached a more open stretch of trail where I could see the sky better between the trees, I felt a brief sense of relief. I kept walking until my legs started to ache, without knowing exactly how much time had passed. I only stopped when I saw in the distance the metallic reflection of my car under the faint moonlight in the improvised parking area. When I reached the car, I unlocked the door with shaking hands and tossed the backpack into the back seat without care. I got in, locked everything, and sat there for a few seconds just breathing, trying to hear if there were any sounds coming from the forest around the parking area. I didn't hear anything. I started the car and left without even adjusting the seat properly, driving slowly at first because of the rough road, but with the urgency of someone who wants to put as much distance as possible between themselves and a place. Only when I reached the main paved road did I feel my body relax a little. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror frequently, expecting to see headlights appear behind me in the dark. They didn't. I drove for more than an hour before stopping at a 24-hour gas station. I went in just to use the bathroom and wash my face. It was there, under the harsh artificial light, that everything began to feel more real than it had on the trail. I took the paper out of my pocket and read the note again. Go away. There was no signature, no direct threat, no explanation. It was a simple, objective instruction, written by someone who knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. I threw the paper into the bathroom trash and watched it fall there, as if that would close something. It didn't. The feeling of having been closely watched, without ever clearly seeing who, stayed with me. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my normal routine, but something had clearly changed. Reviewing the photos on the camera later, I realized there was nothing strange in the files. No unusual images, no unexpected reflections, nothing to indicate that someone had been captured by the lens. In a way, that bothered me even more. The tripod had been positioned carefully, with intention, but not to record anything. It was to mark a fixed point, an angle. Someone had chosen where I would sleep from where I would be observed and made that clear without ever needing to show themselves. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that the note wasn't a generic warning. It was directed at me, in that specific moment, in that specific place. And it was obeyed precisely because it wasn't accompanied by an explicit threat. Today I still photograph landscapes, but I never camp alone on little used trails anymore. I also never leave equipment set up away from the tent at night. The reflection in the water was just the beginning. The moment when something failed in the separation between what I could see and what was happening behind me. What really made me leave was realizing that someone had been there long enough to watch me, move my equipment, and decide that I shouldn't spend the night in that place. I don't know who it was, or why, but I know that on that trail in the state of Washington, someone saw me before I could ever see them back. And that was more than enough for me to never forget that night. Story 6. I was 42 years old when this happened, and I was spending a few days alone in the interior of Oregon. I've always liked secondary trails, the poorly maintained ones, more for the silence than for the challenge. At that point in my life, I needed space. I was dealing with difficult decisions at work and wanted a few days away from any noise that wasn't natural. I chose a trail known precisely for being rarely used, something I had done before without any problems. I arrived in the early afternoon, parked the car at a simple spot along the dirt road, and continued on foot. The trail was narrow, with fallen branches, accumulated dry leaves, and sections where I had to push vegetation aside to pass. I didn't see any recent signs of use. That reassured me. I walked for a few hours until I found a reasonably flat spot to set up the tent, a little off the main trail but still visible from it. I set up camp calmly, taking advantage of the daylight. The forest was dense with tall trees and little wind passing beneath them. The ground was covered with dry leaves and broken branches, which made any step noisy. That always helped me relax because I knew I would hear someone approaching. After eating something simple, I took a short walk around just to familiarize myself with the space and returned to the tent when it began to get dark. I didn't hear any strange noises that first night. I slept relatively well, waking only a few times to normal forest sounds. Up to that point, everything seemed exactly as I expected from an isolated camping trip. I woke up early the next morning with that faint light filtering through the trees. I stepped out of the tent to stretch, and that's when I noticed something different almost immediately. The section of the trail right behind the tent was clean. Where the night before there had been dry leaves, small branches, and uneven ground, there was now a narrow path of exposed dirt. It wasn't wide, and it didn't look like tool work. It looked like someone had carefully removed what made noise. I crouched down to look more closely and saw that the leaves had been pushed to the sides, not scattered. The branches were placed in an organized way, as if someone had calmly opened a passage. That confused me before it made me alert. I thought maybe I hadn't noticed it properly the day before, but the difference was far too big to be distraction. I followed that cleared section with my eyes for a few meters and saw that it connected directly to the main trail. It was a silent access straight to my tent. I stood there for a while trying to rationalize it. Animals don't do that. People rarely do that without a reason. And, most importantly, no one does that during the night without leaving obvious footprints. I looked around for marks in softer soil, but the ground was too dry to register clear tracks. Even so, the feeling that someone had been there while I slept began to weigh on me. I hadn't heard anything during the night, but now I understood why. If someone wanted to approach without being heard, that path would do exactly that. I spent the rest of the morning on alert, but I tried to act normally. I made coffee, organized my pack, and watched the surroundings, expecting to see someone appear on the trail. No one appeared. The silence remained the same, thick, almost comfortable if I ignored what I had seen on the ground. Still, that cleared path wouldn't leave my mind. It wasn't something done in a hurry. It required time, patience, and intention, and it had been made exactly behind my tent, not at some random point. That bothered me because it showed choice. Someone had observed where I was sleeping and decided to open a way to get there. It wasn't official maintenance, it wasn't a marked trail. It was far too targeted. I decided to take a short walk to see if I could find more similar signs. I followed the main trail for a few meters, and as I moved away, I noticed other strange sections. Small areas where leaves had been pushed aside in the same way, creating nearly invisible detours for anyone not specifically looking for them. They didn't form a clear trail, but they looked like options, silent paths that all converged on the clearing where my tent was set up. I stopped in the middle of the trail with a tightness in my chest that was hard to ignore. This hadn't been done by chance or by a single pass. It looked like preparation, as if someone had been mapping routes to move there without making noise, choosing different angles. I went back to the campsite faster than I had planned. Each step felt too loud now, even on ground I knew to be noisy. I started breaking everything down without much organization, with that constant feeling that I was running late. I looked around all the time, expecting to see someone standing between the trees, but I didn't see anyone. Not seeing anyone made it worse. That person, or those people, knew how to move there without leaving obvious traces. I didn't. That created a strange reversal of roles. I was far too visible in a space I had chosen precisely because it was isolated. While I was taking down the tent, I noticed another detail that made me decide to leave without hesitation. A new cleared section had appeared to the left of the clearing, something that hadn't been there when I woke up. The leaves were still damp, as if they had been moved recently. That meant someone had been there while I was walking the trail, while I was observing other access points, maybe even while I was making coffee. There was no longer any way to pretend this had only happened during the night. It was happening in real time, outside my field of vision. The idea that someone could move around my camp without me hearing anything was enough to speed everything up. I put the backpack on my shoulders and left the area without looking back. I didn't run, but I walked fast, body tense and senses alert to any sound out of place. The trail, which had seemed merely abandoned before, now felt monitored. Every bend gave me the sensation of being watched from somewhere outside my line of sight. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear branches breaking. And that, somehow, was even more disturbing. Absolute silence began to feel like a tool, not a coincidence. I only relaxed a little when I reached the car and got inside, locking the doors by reflex. I drove out of the area without stopping, without taking alternative trails, without curiosity. In the days that followed, I thought a lot about it. There was no confrontation, no direct threat, no face to remember. Just clear signs of preparation. Cleared paths, carefully positioned, made for someone to move without being heard to where I slept. To this day, when I think about that trail in the interior of Oregon, what bothers me most isn't imagining who did it, but when. Because someone was there while I was present, active, awake for part of the time, and even so, I never heard anything. That was enough for me to understand that not every abandoned trail is truly empty.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.